All right. Hello and welcome to today's panel discussion, which is number 5 in our series of panel discussions on circular economy. And this one is going to be on the topic of global trade and the circular economy. I'm Pavi. I run Infinitive along with my partner and co-founder Naren, who is also on the other end managing the technicalities of this forum. Before we get started, I would like to very quickly say a big thank you to the EU-REI team and the EU delegation to India for supporting this series and making this happen. A very big thank you to our panelists to come together actually in very short notice to come together for this, what is hopefully going to be a great discussion. And thank you to our participants today for joining us and being on time, which helps us manage our time better as well. It gives me great pleasure to invite Michael Bucchi, Counselor, Head of Section at the Delegation of the European Union to India, to share some opening remarks with us. Thank you for being here, Michael, and welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Pavitra. Can you hear me well?
Very well, thank you.
Good. Good afternoon to all. I'm delighted to see that there is quite a large audience today, and I'm excited to join you for this interesting discussion on global trade and circular economy. I'm new to India, and I'm relatively new to circular economy. I'm a forester by training, but I've seen the potential and the interest shared by Indonesian civil society organizations and stakeholders, as well as the government. So I'm very happy to address this issue that links very strongly EU and India. Let's start with the obvious. You're aware of the EU Green Deal, which is called by our new president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, a new growth strategy. And of course, such a new growth strategy and circular economy in particular are about a systemic transformation of all economic systems. And therefore, we anticipate it could also influence the way we trade with the rest of the world. And that comes obviously with some challenges and barriers to a transformation, but it's also a unique and equally large opportunity to reshape both economic systems. We are basing our approach on what we call designing out waste, which means keeping the products and the materials, as well as their embedded energy and eventually their carbon footprint within the use economy for as long as possible. In the last few decades, the global trade in resources has increased to compensate local resource constraints, needs, and scarcity. The trade in material goods has nearly doubled. Biomass, fossil fuels, metals, minerals. According to the UNEP report released in 2020 on sustainable trade and resources, a third of all material extracted in 2017 were meant for production of goods for trade, for export, with sometimes disproportionate impacts on the environment of exporting countries. So it's important for us as EU and for India as a trade partner to understand how the global trade can be utilized to shift towards more circular patterns of resource use and consumption, to decouple the economic growth from resource use, but also to do that in the context of a just transition and fair multilateralism, leaving no one behind and developing a more transparent, strategic, and open autonomy, as we call it in Europe, for mutual benefits on both ends of the deal. Tapping the full benefits of circular economy implies greater coherence and common understanding of its principles and practices across border. We need to exchange knowledge, best practices, and lessons from economies and countries that are implementing circularity in their own way, domestically. It will also help us to understand how different national circumstances present specific challenges and opportunities across different geographies and levels of governance. The multilateral trade rules and regional trade agreement, as well as tools like standards and intellectual property right policies, can help foster green innovation and reduce the demand for primary raw materials. The UNEP therefore underlines the twin importance of alignment between international trade and environmental legal frameworks, but also alignment of those trade agreements with domestic environmental policies and priorities. The European Commission and the United Nations Environment Programme, in coordination with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, have recently proposed a global alliance on circular economy and resource efficiency toward just transitions. In short, we call it GACERE. The process to launch GACERE would lead to any country, or many countries, hopefully, to endorse it by February 2021. That is the next United Nations Environment Assembly meeting. And we believe that such a government-to-government alliance could drive change at multilateral level, building upon the range of existing partnership and regional alliances on resource efficiency. It could help finding common ground and underpin national transition to circularity, peer-to-peer engagement, and new business partnerships. It could support and raise awareness on positive outcomes for a range of benefits in food systems, resource security, livelihoods, environment, but also an inclusive and sustainable industrialization, which is very core and relevant for India. Many countries are invited to join the alliance, including India, and some responded already. We hope their list will keep on growing. Another important forum that we have our eyes on is the G20. In the wake of COVID-19 was further reaffirmed. And we trust that the Italian, Indonesian, and Indian G20 presidencies in the coming years will keep building up this momentum. In the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, when countries around the globe are all working towards building back better, as the UNEP saying goes, and as Joe Biden also said, the relevance of convergence and collaboration between EU member states and India could help to shape the global agenda. Since 2017, EU and India have a joint resource efficiency initiative, and we have partnered with the Indian government and Indian stakeholders to release a national strategy on resource efficiency with Niti Aayog and work toward state-level renewable resource efficiency strategies and even a national policy in the making. The EU and India have jointly adopted a declaration on resource efficiency and circular economy in July 2020 as part of EU-India summit, and underlined their joint commitment, in particular to research, development, and finance. We also draw particular attention to digitalization, which we see as a key enabler for the development of sustainable business models and greater circularity, including in global trade. If you have any questions, please, I invite you to contact our EU-REI colleague, Dr. Hakna Aora, who's in the room, if you're interested to learn more. The EU delegation and myself, once again, thank our moderator, Pavitra, and our panelists, Marianne, Kristin, Shunta, Vincent, and Enrique. I look forward to learning from your discussions this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think we lost you on video for a second. I'm not sure if that was just me, but thank you so much for setting that context. Many of the themes that you mentioned will be picked up by our panelists, including ones on just transition and convergence and collaboration. And thank you also for outlining some of these key movements with the Global Alliance on Circular Economy, and also the EU-India cooperation and some specific aspects that are going to be a focus going forward in that cooperation. You mentioned our panelists. I feel I should introduce them once again. I see all your videos are already on, so thank you so much for that. We have an absolutely stellar panel here today. I sometimes ask myself what I'm doing moderating this panel, but we have Kristin Hughes, who's the director of the Global Plastic Action Partnership and executive director at the World Economic Forum. We have Shunta Yamaguchi, policy analyst of the Environment and Economy Integration Division at the OECD Environment Directorate. We have Vincent Van Noor, Director Europe at the European Business and Technology Center. We've got Marianne Kutunen, Head of Global Challenges and Sustainable Development Goals at the Institute for European Environmental Policy. And we have Enrique Pacini, economist at UNCTAD. This is an absolutely fantastic panel that brings together so many different elements. And what I also understand, in the process of putting together the panel is these are some of the early thinkers in the space of trade and circular economy. So absolutely thrilled to have all of you here. Welcome on board. All right, let me then kickstart the conversation. In addition to everything that Michael said, just to put in context where we are, the conversation around trade and circular economy is still relatively new, even at the global forums. And it's only been, I think, at the fore of a lot of thinking in the last couple of years. It's even newer to me, but like I said, not to our panelists. So I really look forward to learning from them how they're thinking about, this whole intersection of trade and circular economy. As we look at this intersection, we're going to try and understand what are some of the challenges. How do we look at this in terms of developing coherence between what are international trade policies and domestic movements and policies towards the circular economy? A very, very quick anecdote. Back in 2018, the early part of 2018, one of the early team members here at Infinitive, she was a young kid who had just graduated college, said to me, hey, but what about the impact of trade from this massive shift to circular economy? And I said, well, I haven't really thought about it. And apparently it was around the same time that at the global forums, a lot of these discussions were, being kickstarted, obviously, at a very different level from what we were talking about back home in my house at Infinitive. But I think we'll learn a little bit more about where all of that started and how it's going. So that's sort of my little introduction. I think for my very first question, I'm going to come over to you, Shinta. You've done some great work, and I think one of the first papers I've seen actually on trade and CE came out from OECD, at least in the public domain. Do you want to set some context for us on when you're talking about circular economy, what are the different levels in the product value chain where the domestic circular economy, national policies towards circular economy intersect with international trade policies?
Yes, thank you very much, Tavi, for the introduction, and thank you very much to the organizers for having me to this very exciting event on global trade and circular economy. As Pavi and others have said, the trade and circular economy is not very new. It's quite a recent agenda that has emerged. At the OECD, I think it really started with one meeting where one trade official said that waste as a valuable resource needs to be traded more freely to contribute to the circular economy. And a waste management expert at the same meeting said, oh, that's terrible because the waste is going to go to far corners of the world and dumped where the fate is unknown. So it really made us think that this is an issue with very different perspectives, and we need to have a more deeper look on that. And just to illustrate the linkages between trade and circular economy, maybe if I could have a slide up, Nareen, if you could put up my concept paper slide. And if you could share the screen. So we started to look at this as sort of a concept. And here we have the linear economy where we produce, consume, and dispose when products reach end of life. And the circular economy aims to close loops in various ways. Click, please. Yes, so here we see from the top side, we can close material loops by recycling, refurbishment, and manufacturing, reuse, and repair. More upstream towards the left-hand side of this slide, you have eco-design policies that can extend product lifetimes. And on the bottom, we also have product service systems where products can be provided as a service instead of the product itself. And by the ownership with the producers, they will tend to last longer and easier to retrieve when they reach end of life. Click, please. These initiatives happen a lot of times within national boundaries, but they do have important interlinkages with trade. Click, please. And there are three ways. So the first one is through global supply chains. So countries do not source only domestically, but they also source across borders, and therefore your supply chains extend across borders. Click, please. The second one is on end-of-life value chains. So trade can happen in trade in second-hand goods, trade in goods for refurbishment and manufacturing, trade in waste for recovery, and trade for secondary raw materials. And the third one, click, please, is the role of services trade, because the circular economy has high service sector involvement. And these trade flows and the boundaries between trade and circular economy has different pressure points. And last click, please. There are four of them, starting from the left top-hand side. There will be impacts of the circular economy transition on trade. The second one on the left middle side, there will be necessary policy coherence between these two areas. Shifting on to the right-hand side, we need to understand the nature of trade in waste, secondary raw materials, second-hand goods. And on the left bottom, we need to have a better understanding or better identify the role of international cooperation to facilitate these trade flows to work for the circular economy. And we've started to investigate all these pressure points in our work currently right now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shunta, for sharing that. Sorry, I'm not sure if we lost you or if you wanted me to take over.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so thank you for that very great overview. And I think a lot of the points you mentioned is what we're going to talk through in the rest of this conversation. And to pick up on that, Marianne, can I invite you you've been looking at the EU Circular Economy Action Plan and sort of what are some of the implications of that on trade and material flows. Do you want to give us a very quick overview of what the thinking there is?
Absolutely. Thank you, Pavi, and thank you for the invitation. Nice to be here today with all of you. So looking at the EU Circular Economy Action Plan, which basically is the way EU is taking its Green Deal forward, or one of the key ways of EU taking its Green Deal forward that Michael already mentioned earlier this morning. I can maybe identify three key ways through which the EU's Circular Economy Action Plan will have implications through trade to the world. So firstly, in the context of the action plan, there will be much more closing the loop in the EU planned. So looking at reduction of exports of waste to recycling outside the EU, doing more of the recycling in the EU itself, and especially focusing on preventing unsustainable exports, particularly of plastics, low quality plastics to high quantity of plastics outside the EU. So trying to make this balance better that we have experienced to be at miss in the past when the Circular Economy Action Plan 1.0 was implemented, and what happened was that EU was exporting waste unsustainably to the world. So addressing that. So that's one key trade-related implication from the EU Circular Economy Action Plan. There will be changes in the EU's demand for primary resources as a consequence of that, particularly perhaps linking to critical raw materials such as phosphorus or lithium. So EU is trying to be more self-sufficient in terms of using these internally in the EU once they've been imported. This can mean less demand for primary resources from countries that export them. In principle, this can have two implications to the exporting countries. So, in a good side, less pressure on extraction in the countries can have positive impacts in the exporting country as a shift. But obviously, if a country, trade partner country, is very much dependent on exporting primary raw materials, and EU then lowers its demands, that can have negative socioeconomic consequences on the country, because the country has developed its sustainable development path on at least some level of primary material extraction. So this is going to be especially the case with developing countries, and in this case, obviously, this trade partnership between the EU and the trade partner should be looked at and see what can be done with this shift, and then to support the trade partner country as well. And then the third and really important element of what happens when EU is shifting to circular economy and implementing its circular economy action plan is the changes to product and production standards. So a key element of EU circular economy action plan is to improve product and production standards to be more circular, to be more low carbon. And when EU improves its standards domestically, this will also lead to EU looking at similar standards when importing to the EU. So also this creates markets in the EU for higher standards, but also kind of demand that EU is looking at higher standards in terms of imports to the EU, and that will have obviously impacts to the trade partner countries. Ideal world, and that's where we're going to be hoping to get to, is that EU will this way help to elevate the standards also globally through its trade partners. But those three kinds of main ways we've been identifying and looking at when we think about EU's circular economy implementation in the future and trade impacts to the world.
Excellent. Thank you, Marianne, for that very sort of concise overview of what these implications are. We'll pick back up on how the EU can do that in just a little bit. But when you talk circular economy, one of these big shifts is obviously the EU Circular Economy Action Plan. But one of the other things we're all talking about is the Basel Convention and the inclusion of most kinds of plastic waste, and which is coming into play from early next year, I think Jan 2021. So I'm going to bring Kristin into the conversation here. Kristin, you work extensively on plastics. What are some of the challenges that we're going to see in operationalizing these new amendments to the Basel Convention with plastics particularly?
Hi, Poppy, and thank you again for the invitation to be here. It's wonderful to see these excellent panelists also joining this conversation. And it's wonderful also to build on some of these other points, as Marianne has talked about some of the standards and harmonizing and what does it mean for importation. And I think we're going to see a lot of these kinds of issues, let's say, and opportunities arise as the Basel Convention starts to come into play at the start of next year. So as some of you likely know, just give a quick background, the Basel Convention is this very groundbreaking mechanism that's been in place for a number of decades to combat what's known as toxic trade of hazardous waste across boundaries. And we've really seen momentum behind it growing, because a few years ago, 187 parties to the Basel Convention adopted what is known as the Plastics Amendment. So this is really adding to what types of plastic waste can be controlled, what can be imported, exported, traded across borders. And it was a clear signal of the growing consensus that trade policy actually can and should play an important role in halting the unsustainable growth of mismanaged plastic waste and to reduce plastic pollution overall. So what we're seeing in January 2021, the amendments to the Basel Convention will actually start coming into play. And they are an important effort to try to stop basically plastic waste dumping. And so we've got some parts of this amendment that say that plastic waste that is sorted, clean, uncontaminated, and effectively designed for recycling can be traded freely, while other types will have to require consent from the export and the import transit countries. So some of you in the trade world will understand the prior informed consent or the PIC procedure. So we're looking for opportunities of the convention that are positive. So there will be challenges, I believe, in operationalizing this, and similar to what Marianne described around the standards and the need for standards on importation, I think we really need also some harmonization here to understand better what the rules really mean, like what constitutes hazardous and clean, and what do we do to help countries who don't have their own high quality recycling facilities, and will they be able to engage in the necessary processes in order to meet these standards for the transboundary movement of goods. So I think as the first best outcome, it's really for us to align on what constitutes sorted, clean, uncontaminated. And then we'd also like to urge governments and businesses to take stronger, more concerted action on things incentivizing around, say, EPR, or the extended producer responsibility, because that also will start to promote the circular economy and packaging redesign within countries as we start to think about these standards for transboundary movement as well. Thank you, Poppy.
Thank you, Kristin. I saw Shunta nodding away. I know he wants to say a lot about some of those points you brought up. But before we head back to Shunta, I'm going to bring Enrique in because very often this conversation around circular economy tends to be around plastics, which is important, but there's also other materials. And I think, Enrique, I've seen some fascinating work from you on network analysis of scrap trade globally, and sort of also comparing what happens with plastics versus some of the non-plastic materials, including some ferrous metals, paper, and textiles. Do you want to run us through what some of your key findings have been in terms of the volume, the value, and also the carbon footprint and the impact of those of that trade and scrap around the world? I know there are parts of our audience that have very frequently asked us for where's the data, I want the data, and I'm particularly happy, like Enrique, that you can give us some data on this here. I think you're muted, Enrique.
Can you hear me now? Changing
Perfect.
microphones. Okay, sorry for this. Well,
no
thanks again for the invitation, and also thanks for the panelists. It's always an opportunity to learn, and I think you put a lot of responsibility on my shoulders, Pavi. Hope I'll make up for it. Well, as you presented, I work for the UN Trade Agency, but most of the things I will be discussing here will be in a personal capacity because of the research you mentioned is research I did while I was on leave. You can see that the topic is fascinating to me, of circular economy and trade. And one thing I found out while I sort of entered it well into this world is that if you want to do something slightly different and to avoid the cliches, it's very important to find some niche. For example, you really get into negotiations or trade policy from the OECD WTO perspective, or from the EU-centric approach, or some technology area like plastics. And from there, you can sort of put some bricks into the equation. One of I don't know if you can have to put the slides that I sent you on the screen to illustrate for the audience. Yeah, oh yeah, you can leave that one. I'll probably start in a different order and not go into the different materials first. But this is a snapshot of the, if you can roll to the back, to the first one, the network. Yeah, fine, thank you. This is a snapshot of the trade of scrap plastics in the world. I analyzed together with some co-authors the flow of plastic waste in 2018, so after China's ban, and the network analysis is part of the complexity theory. So there's a lot of things you can extract from network analysis, and I think you only scratch the surface. But nevertheless, this has a lot of utility for various types of practitioners, and I'm going to explain why. This snapshot shows, for example, in different colors, which are the clusters of countries that are engaged in trade of plastics. And for example, there are 6 main clusters. For example, headed by the United States. You can see that India, for example, is under the influence of the United States cluster. And there's another big cluster in Europe headed by Germany as the influencing country. The network space is different from the geographical space. So countries can be neighbors, even though they are not physically neighbors, only due to the strength of their commercial transactions. So it's this is quite interesting that you see also an underrepresentation of countries like African countries and Latin American countries, which raises all sorts of questions of whether there's informal trade of plastic waste going on, whether there enough capacity of customs officials to properly classify waste, plastic scrap being passed through their harbors and logistical ports. One of the things we calculated in that paper, which was published in the Sustainable Production Conference recently, it's called International Analysis of International Trade in Plastic Scrap, is the centralities of countries. So we try to rank each country according to different network metrics, which are established in literature, For example, the degree centrality of a country in a network means just how many connections this country has. It doesn't matter how strong connections are. For example, India and the United States have a very strong connection to large volumes of plastic waste being traded. But degree centrality only measures how many connections the country has. Closeness centrality, the other metric we looked at, sees if countries act as bridges between markets. For example, there is the European-centric market, and there's the EU-centric. Sorry, there's the US-centric market. Which countries are bridging those two, let's say, clusters of countries? So this is very important to understand, because working with the countries that are bridges, it's very important for dissemination of technology and also standard across different geographies. And finally, we looked at the eigenvector centralities, which are important to find countries which are connected to other countries who are themselves very influent in that market. So there's a whole discussion, and we attempt to interpret those results. This can be useful to identify countries that are very important to be on the negotiation table of standard, actively speaking, in the Basel, for example, amendments, or countries which are likely to be very good candidates for infrastructure deployment, for example, for upcycling of plastics. There are a lot of public and private dimensions of information that are important in network analysis. And of course, network analysis can be extended to other products much beyond plastics. One of the things we find is that, again, some regions like Latin America and Africa are very underrepresented. We wonder why. And also there's usually when countries are engaged in a commercial transaction in plastic waste, for example, in a country declaring an export to another country which is importing, usually what the exporter declares doesn't match what the importer declares. Normally that happens because the importer declares a higher value, because it has insurance, it's a CIF calculated. But in the case of plastic waste, usually what the exporter is declaring is a higher value. So there's this mismatch. We don't know exactly why this is happening, but it's an interesting point that we saw in the export statistics. Basically, it's looking at mirror data, as they call. Yeah, and if you can move to another slide that I provided. Yeah, so this is a Sankey diagram. There's nothing really fancy about it. We just looked at the main material exporters, and we go here a bit beyond plastics. We look at plastics, ferrous metals, so iron, steel, scrap, paper waste, and textiles, used textiles. And this is a picture of the mass flow of the kilograms of material being sent. The main immediate insight is that plastics are a small part of the story. I think plastics, all the work on plastic could be used as a lever for policy alignment in material stewardship that caters for different types of materials being traded around the world. This is, by the way, data from UN-Comtrade. It's easily accessible. And you can also see that in terms of mass, iron, steel, and paper by far overpass plastic and textiles. Only by looking at their weight. If you can go to the next slide. If you see a different dimension of things like the value of exports, you see that plastics continue to be a minor flow. Iron steel are very large flows, and Turkey is a big country in the iron steel scrap network. And you see that the weight of textiles has already increased quite a bit. And if you look at the emissions, look at the third slide, please. Yeah, well, this is a calculated emissions based on literature, looking at how many kilograms of CO2 usually have per kilogram of material produced. You see that the weight of textiles grows dramatically, for example, because you see that textiles have a very large emissions factor associated to their weight, and you see that the short story is, depending on the material, depending on the dimension you're looking at, there are different impacts of trade of its used varieties of secondary trade, and and textiles can be a big thing in terms of their emissions, even though they're a very small thing in terms of their weight being. So there are a lot of small dimensions here. There's a whole discussion that can be raised on which are the main exporting or importing countries, whether there's governance in the receiving end. But our goal is just to use this network analysis, perhaps to work with other colleagues, for example, Chatham House, who has recently published a very nice secondary material trade explorer, to try to create a tool that people use and help them in both in trade policy and also in business, to try to identify countries and their metrics related to their specific secondary material. And hopefully that will become embedded into the policy toolkit we use, like the Observatory for Economic Complexity or other sources we all use in our work. Thank you, Pavi.
Thank you, Enrique. That's a pretty extensive analysis, and when you sent us the slides earlier, Naren and I, we're poring over that last night, and I think there's more than what you presented here. That's some fantastic analysis that's gone on. So just quickly moving on from data to something that's happening on the ground, Vincent, I'd love to bring you into the conversation here. As EBTC, you're looking at facilitating a cross-border collaborative model for waste management in Goa. I wonder if you can talk us through, for waste management in Goa, what are some of the challenges you're seeing, and what is this model that you're potentially exploring and trying to build out?
So thank you so much, Pavi. Good afternoon, everybody. Very nice to be here. It's a pleasure in this audience. So we are executing. We are the consortium partner of a project called the EU-India Policy Dialogues, the business support to the EU-India Policy Dialogues. And in this avatar, we are supporting the REI, an initiative in Goa, where last February, the Goa strategy paper was launched for the circular economy and resource efficiency, for which the REI group was instrumental. And in these consultation sessions, which led to this strategy paper, with all the different actors that are there in the ecosystem within the region of Goa, one of the strong things that came out was to look at a village level initiative. If you go and analyze at the village level, you can see what is really actually happening there on the ground. That will give you insights as to what are the challenges, what are the possible solutions, and if you can create system processes that work there, then you can do actually something substantial for the state itself. So by interacting with the various actors locally, starting from the Chief Minister's office, for the past 5 months we've been doing this while we're doing this project during COVID times, which is at times a bit of a challenge. So we've been interacting with several government bodies, some public sector undertakings, with waste management companies, with village heads, with waste collection companies. And what was quite interesting to see is that on such a micro level, there are so many different actors and so many different players and different companies that do waste. Certain waste collectors, they only pick up certain kinds of waste. There are many waste generators that fall through the cracks, so their waste is not collected. So many of these organizations, they have data, but the data is always also not clear because not everything is tracked. So in our research, we're looking, trying to find out what is the exact data, what are the types of materials, what are the quantities, what are the flows. We've had a little bit some bottlenecks. So we did some research and we found that in Europe there are some solutions, some online platforms which are utilized and are quite successful, where you can map the different players that are there who generate the waste. You can see what type of waste they create, what are the quantities, and the idea is to create some kind of a peer-to-peer system where that you can do direct transactions and people are aware immediately of what types of waste are there and is that of interest to them, and then they can also do the financial transaction through this platform. So then we in that process we are able to map everybody, to see real data, what are the different materials. We come up with circular solutions that the waste actually gets a home. create transparency, and in the process, we look at also the citizens in the village, and by having them use these tools, we also look at we create awareness, because there's a huge lack of awareness as well for segregation, how to treat your waste, and then also we'll be looking at behavioral change. So a digital platform where we can put all this together and look at ultimately circular solutions for the waste here at the local level. That's one of the things that we're looking at. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you, Pavi. Okay,
great. Thanks, Vincent. In terms of there's you're looking at different solutions that could work on ground, and I think, Kristin, I was wondering if you'd want to pick up on this in the work that you've done. You've examined sort of cross-border challenges to scaling up plastics, circular plastics at a global level, and I think one of the points that you touch upon as well, which has come up from companies, is easing the whole investment facilitation. Particularly with technologies to deal with waste and stuff. Do you want to pick up on that a little bit and tell us what the conversation there has been about?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Pavi. And actually, I was taking some notes because I really appreciate what Vincent just said there. I mean, there's so many things that we can also learn and utilize better data flows that will help us to bring even more investment as well, right? So I think increasing, I love the way that was described, of mapping in real time and creating a greater transparency, because I think that what we're seeing is that there's a fear from the traditional investment firms to actually finance capital improvements in waste management in the circular economy. And so, hearing about that data platform could create that transparency that might actually bring incentives if people are better aware around where they could have an impact and what that financing could look like. So I'm really actually quite curious to learn more from Vincent, perhaps post-panel. But really, what we've been also exploring as part of the Global Plastic Action Partnership, we're built on 3 panels, and actually the 3 pillars. And the second is around data collection, analysis, insights, and action roadmaps. And then upon that, we're looking to build finance insights. And part of that is really unlocking what it's going to take to bring these robust investments into waste management, into the circular economy for plastics that really can ignite change. And we're seeing that quite a bit of work could be done to create this climate for recycling services, including exploring financial or regulatory incentives. This includes around the production and consumption of recycled plastic. We'd look at development aid and technical assistance that could be explored. This could support development of recycling services, waste management, sorting, even behavior change.
I think I'm going to request participants, if they're not muted, to please mute yourself. I think we're hearing some conversation we're not really supposed to be hearing.
Thanks, Pavi, and appreciate the enthusiasm from all participants, right? So, but no, we're seeing this opportunity both from the traditional financial organizations, but also possibly through development aid, technical assistance that could also be explored that would really help with the development of recycling services. This is what I was saying, and actually sort of building on what Vincent was saying around how do you incentivize behavior change through these investments of education, awareness building, etc., but also waste management in emerging economies, which could really be a component for combating illicit or informal trade as well. So we understand that in recent months, some of the WTO members have already begun to explore the global trade policy contribution to cross-border plastic waste and circular economy. And some of these financial mechanisms could be seen in things around lowering tariffs on biopolymers. So that's a way of promoting policy coherence that limits exports of materials banned in domestic markets. How can we think about encouraging regulatory cooperation on trade-related measures and capacity building? So I see that when we start thinking around the scaling up of the circularity of plastics, there are a number of different financial mechanisms and investments that will be needed. But this needs to be much bigger than just funding through the traditional World Bank, and other development banks, but also much broader conversation through what we would normally call traditional finance mechanisms that currently do not see an opportunity for returns on investments in the circular economy, and most notably in plastics and waste management.
Thank you, Kristin, for elaborating on that. And I think, we've been talking about data and, the need for transparency. I mean, the lack of data and the need for transparency. And I think I'm going to come back to here, Enrique, as part of your analysis. I think you touched upon this a little bit in your earlier presentation, but you had a lot of interesting observations on, how transaction values are recorded. I wonder if you want to elaborate on some of that, just to help us understand what are these, this inconsistencies in data we're talking about, as the rest of the panelists have brought up.
The data area of especially of material flows, secondary material flows in world trade is a whole universe. There's a lot of things that can be done. There are a lot of questions that were raised by the study that I conducted, for example, on why there's this discrepancy for the same commercial pair, like for example, the US transacting with Canada. Why is what Canada is saying that is important different than what the US says exporting? So these discrepancies happen for basically all countries to a greater or smaller extent, and it raises questions such as could there be an improvement in the AHS codes for specific products? Could there be capacity programs for customs officials, especially in developing countries, to better classify trade? Could there be a platform for trade statistical agencies to talk to each other? But I'm sure there are many statistical working groups aware of this issue. Normally, when you have a commercial transaction, usually the amount that is declared by the importer, the value that is declared by the importer, should be a bit higher because it includes usually insurance. But what we saw in the trade waste material, waste plastic specifically, was the opposite. The value declared by the exporter was higher. We need to have in mind that plastic waste or any type of scrap material, depending on how you see it, it could be seen as from the economic perspective as a non-good, so as something you want to get rid of instead of something you want to get access to, even though everything is recorded a positive value in the country. But I don't know if there's a political factor of to show that we are shipping out a lot of plastic scrap and we are importing less, importing little. There could be some kind of appearance game going on, but there are many questions without an answer. And I think each of those questions, the capacity building question, the data transparency from the exporter or importer side, those things can be dealt with by separate the individual processes to focus on results. So there is a lot of things that can happen. And one of the questions I was left with in my mind is, would those patterns be similar for other products? For example, for used batteries or for scrap ferrous metals, which we didn't go into so much detail. By the way, and those data discrepancies even change once you look at the type of plastic. Talked about general plastics in terms of aggregate. If you go to PVC, if you go to ethylene, if you go to styrene, then you have also different data challenges specific to the polymers. Some of them are more, for example, PVC is complicated to recycle.
Right. Thank you for elaborating on that, Enrique. I think, like you said, the data part alone, we could spend a lot of time sort of dissecting and figuring out what can be done there. But I'm going to move from data a little bit into policy. I know a lot of you want to comment on that. Vincent, maybe I can come back to you. You mentioned you were speaking to a lot of the stakeholders all the way across that ecosystem. What are some of the things that you're hearing from the stakeholders on policy changes that they think would enable or accelerate, like amp up the sector and increase the use of secondary raw materials?
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. Thanks for that. So what we've learned after engaging with all the different stakeholders, like you mentioned, who are part of the value chain, the ecosystem, is that right now in India, currently we have GST, goods and service tax. Earlier we had service tax only. at that time, there was on secondary materials, there was 0% tax was levied. Now, since we have incorporated GST in India, it's clear that if you want to buy raw materials, you have to pay 12% GST. And if you sell processed materials, secondary materials, again, there's 12% tax that's levied upon it. So many people different parties have said that, you know, maybe I can use a platform like this where I can convey this message and say that, you know, it would be a huge incentive if they could go back to when there was still service tax and that these taxes could be waived off for secondary products. That would be give a huge boost to this to the system and the producers.
Great.
Yeah.
Sorry, did you want to go ahead? It's a little difficult to interpret these things on the online format.
No, that's it.
Okay,
Thanks.
cool. Thank you, Vincent. And I think Shunta and Marianne, I'd love to bring both of you into the conversation here. Shunta, I mean, we heard like one example of a policy at a domestic level that might help to amp up that sector, but you've talked a lot about how these domestic policies, play off against international trade policies. Do you want to talk us through, just what are some of those tensions and, what we need to keep in mind when we're looking at framing of some of these policies, either with a specific example Vincent mentioned or anything else that you've worked on earlier?
Yes, thank you, Pavi, and thank you for also all the panelists for bringing a lot of good insights on the trade dimension of the circular economy. And by turning to the policy issues, I think I would want to first start by saying that with the work that we're doing and looking at the role of trade, we really think that trade does have an opportunity to support the circular economy transition by help achieving economies of scale for recyclables and materials to be better used. For instance, in India, I think this was data from 2014, but around 40% of global secondary steel production was from India. But the domestic supply of secondary scrap of steel was not significant, and therefore implies that trade has played an important role here. So trade does have a role to play, but we also need to understand that benefits should not be at the consequence of environment degradation and environmental pollution, and how to strike the right balance between that is the question, and what policies can actually do. So we actually really need to have a better distinction of trade that we do want for the circular economy and the trade fractions that we don't want for the circular economy. And therefore, we need more transparency and traceability, as Vincent and Kristin and also Enrique touched upon. But I think there are 5 ways in helping for policies to support these areas. The first, for securing resilient value chains for the circular economy, we need better definitions, classification, and also investigation, diving in how to better classify the harmonized system codes, trade codes that Enrique was saying. The second is the role of standards, where Marianne has pointed out earlier on in her intervention. Circular economy related standards are emerging, such as material quality, material content, recyclable content, repairability, also product quality and material quality standards. And these are fragmenting in different jurisdictions, while they have an important role to support the circular economy. And therefore, we need to see ways how to reduce fragmentation, regulatory fragmentation in this area as much as possible. The third one is the role of regulation. And here, I'd like to point to maybe 2 or 3 points. One is on illegal waste trade that undermines, first of all, the benefits from trade to support the circular economy transition. And illegal trade also on waste in particular also puts pressure on the recipient countries. So therefore, we need better enforcement and international cooperation at the borders. The second point is for trade fractions to happen with some controls, this prior informed consent procedure that Kristin also turned to. So you need an agreement with the exporter and importer beforehand to make those transactions happen, could be a way to go forward to safeguards, as we are seeing with the Basel amendments. However, we also hear from the industry that they do sometimes put off some delays. There are some more transaction costs, and they often take more time than anticipated. So we really need to ensure the swift implementation of these systems. The fourth role is the role of innovation, in particular digital product passports, blockchain technologies that could provide new opportunities to secure better data, transparency, and traceability, and we need to see how these can actually support policies. And my final point is on trade facilitation mechanism, such as trusted trader programs, authorized operator programs, which they try to facilitate trade flows, not at the borders, but at the industry level, who are actually making these transactions. And I think these mechanisms also merit to be explored further. So that's all from my side.
Thank you, Shunta. Marianne, maybe I can invite you to just pick up from what Shunta was saying and add on very specifically this dimension of how EU trade policy can enable the circular transition sort of globally. I know Shunta mentioned some things, but maybe very specifically bringing in the EU angle here would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pavi. And thank you, fellow panelists. It's already been absolutely brilliant. And here's a spoiler. Obviously, my points will very much echo what has already been said before, but I'll try to bring that to the EU context specifically. So before moving on to my general recommendations as to what the EU trade specifically can and should do, I just want to really echo what Shunta was saying. So it really is about looking at how EU trade can be a vehicle for sustainable and fair shift to circular economy. This is not going to be sustainable and fair globally by default, and that's something that we at IEP really want to emphasize. We need to put some conscious effort as EU and EU policy designers to make sure that we do our best that the circular economy shift will be sustainable globally as well. So that's really, I think, simply echoing what Shunta was saying, what kind of trade we want, being more specific, understanding the flows and what can we do with that. But building on that general emphasis to, what can EU do for sustainable global circular economy trade? First thing to say is that we can obviously use EU's trade and trade agreements specifically, dedicatedly to facilitate circular economy trade. EU is one of the biggest trading blocs. EU has a lot of bilateral trade agreements already existing or under negotiation, and all these can be really used specifically to facilitate circular economy related trade, to take down the barriers and also champion circular economy. So taking down the barriers means lower tariffs, but it also specifically means those non-tariff related barriers that people have been mentioning, those definitions, those standards, and working in the context of EU trade agreements to improve that flow of products, circular products, by improving the understanding and harmonization of standards. One thing, in addition to standards for products, and I think people often think about products first when they think about circular economy, but fellow panelists have mentioned already services and investment. And I think that's basically where EU trade agreements particularly should focus on, also looking at the service trade, facilitating service trade for circular economy and investment specifically as well, because we know that these circular businesses, it's not all about products, it really needs services to go with it as well, and it needs the investment to facilitate that. So it's kind of the combination of these three aspects, all of them which EU needs to focus on and can use its trade to focus on as well. So that's something that EU and EU trade agreements can do. Just quickly on EU-India relationship. So EU and India don't have a specific trade agreement in place, bilateral trade agreement. But EU and India are trading under what's called a generalized scheme of preferences. So there is a trade relationship in there where there are some preferential schemes being used. And that particular scheme globally in the EU is being currently under review. And perhaps this review provides a good emphasis for also EU and India to explore what they can do in the context of the resource efficiency cooperation that is already going on, specifically on trade as well. So that's some thinking ahead, looking at the EU trade framework specifically for India. Now, very briefly, other things that EU trade can do. Obviously, we have talked about those definitions and standards as key barrier. So as said already before, EU trade policy can help to standardize the standards between trade partners, elevate the product and production standards globally as well. So that's where we should really focus. And this type of mechanism or logic has happened before when it comes to chemicals and vehicles. So EU has put in place regulations for chemicals and vehicles in the past to improve their sustainability, environmental standards, and that has changed the global flows and the markets and increased the markets for sustainable products in these sectors. So that logic works, and it can work for circular economy as well through EU trade. And finally, I think it was Michael who mentioned first the whole idea of leave no one behind in this circular transition. So the EU circular policy and EU as a trade negotiator can help to leave no one behind globally in this shift, and lots of fellow panelists have really mentioned this from different angles. So having dialogues with trade partner countries to see if there are any negative impacts on the EU's shift to them and addressing those, but fundamentally really helping to pick up the opportunities that the EU's shift can provide to countries for developing economies, particularly using tools, just developing cooperation policy, I think mentioned, for example, by Kristin, aid for trade policy to support capacity at the national and even local level, as Vincent had also highlighted. That's all that EU can do, and EU's trade policy, in addition to development cooperation policy, can do together. It really is important that we support also the national local capacity. I can't emphasize that enough, because trade can't happen and trade opportunities can't be picked up if there isn't awareness, technology, investment happening at that scale to be able to benefit from the opportunities that EU trade can offer. So those are my few pennies worth in terms of EU's trade potential. It's definitely there, but we just really need to consciously make it work.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Marianne. We focused on the EU as a region, but Kristin, I'm going to come back to you to say, in terms of plastics as a material stream, is there anything you want to build on with what Shunta and Marianne have brought about the trade policy options, or is there anything that's different that we have to take in account with plastics? Do you want to just throw light on some of those aspects for us?
Yes, thanks, Pavi. And indeed, I don't know if I'll be repeating or building on, because I think there's a richness of views that have already been shared that are very aligned with my own. But one of the things that we would say is, from that global perspective, that trade is absolutely critical to, as I mentioned earlier, to facilitate investment in countries. Absolutely need that infrastructure around waste management, recycling facilities, and other day-to-day requirements to support this transition to a circular economy. But it can also facilitate, and this is, Marianne was describing this a bit, but it can facilitate also this transfer of green technologies. So how can we encourage greater innovation, support the production of cleaner raw materials, and improve waste management processes through the technologies needed? So trade actually can be quite a facilitator and an incentive for bringing these kinds of green technologies to light. I'd also say, when thinking about the broader trade policy space, there's also a need to start thinking about addressing the subsidies that promote unsustainable plastics production. So trade, including fossil fuel feedstocks for plastics, for instance, and at both this can be at both the domestic but also at the multilateral levels. So I think doing this can also help to shrink that pricing gap between virgin and recycled polymers. Of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we all saw, this massive downslope of virgin pricing on and the pricing on virgin plastic, which was a real shame because of the oil prices plummeting. And so, how can we really address that in a way that supports an infrastructure and a desire and a demand for recycled plastics? So we at the World Economic Forum earlier this year actually released an excellent paper on this very topic, on how trade policy can remove the barriers for combating plastic waste, and how we can really start to begin the steps that we need to take to transition to circular economy. This was developed after extensive consultation with over 50 experts and people who know this far better than I, across a wide range of sectors. And so, we can share the chart in the link in the chat, I believe, and then follow up with any questions or future engagement. But, as India is looking at this also from a very specific country lens, but other countries also considering it, there are opportunities, of course, to consider import tariffs, bans, restrictions on certain types of plastic waste, environmental taxes and charges that can be extended through EPR schemes, and just the removal of subsidies that promote the virgin plastic production and the trade of such through these fossil fuels. I would say that's one of the most important things for us to begin to look at, are those subsidies, government procurement policies, and regulations that can really improve supply chain transparency. Thanks, Poppy.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristin, so much for that. And thanks to all three of you sort of, reinforcing what the others were saying, but also bringing out very specific aspects of particular regions or waste streams. Shunta, I believe we'll come over to you now. We've talked about trade policy options, but you've done some, at the OECD, you've done some great work, a modeling assessment on what the impact of circular economy policies will be on trade. And I think that's projected to 2040 or 60, if I'm right. Do you want to take us through that and what some of your key findings from there have been? And I believe this is where we'll ask Naren to bring up the slides as well.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Pavi. So if Naren can bring up the slides, and while he does, I'll talk about a little bit about the background of this project. So in my first diagram, I was showing several pressure points, and among that, this is the point where if the circular economy transition happens, how would our trade patterns change? And so it's taking several steps to undertake this analysis. And this is modeling work that projects our economies and materials use up to 2060. So we first made a baseline under the assumption that there will be no additional circular economy or resource efficiency policies in place beyond 2017. And with that baseline, if we do consider some resource efficient and circular economy policies, how would that affect our economies and trade as well? So here we see these figures up to 2040. And just to explain a little bit more about what kind of circular economy and resource efficiency policies we've considered, this is basically a physical reform of circular economy and resource efficiency objectives. So putting in place taxes on primary raw materials and then subsidies to secondary raw materials. And we've only looking at physical policies because they were the ones that were more modelable by our modeling colleagues. Obviously, there are other instruments such as extended producer responsibility, labeling, government procurement, and so on and so forth, but we've just focused on the physical policies now. And here we look at how the outputs would change, the blue bars, and then how the export would change, the gray bars. And basically, the findings are in the 2 bullet points below. So the first one is that the production changes from primary to secondary materials. So you see that the gray bars compared to the baseline, the blue bars for some of the primary materials on your left-hand side are dropping, and then the recycling outputs on the right-hand side are boosting. And then, however, what this means for trade is that there is still higher trade, both in primary and secondary materials, because of more specialization. So the production will concentrate in certain countries that have comparative advantage, and therefore these countries would be exporting more and trade would happen more under this assumption. Now, next slide, please. And when we look at the regional sort of setting on this, and we try to unpack this between three effects, so domestic policy effect, international policy effect, and trade interaction effect. What this means is that domestic policies is the home countries implement these policies where the rest of the world does not. The international policy effect is where the rest of the world implements these policies, but the home countries does not. And the last one is the interaction between the two. And this is very difficult to interpret, but the baseline is that although there will, under the assumption that we will have a uniform implementation of resource efficiency and circular economy policies across the board, the way how it affects exports depend from region to region because of specialization, as I just referred to. And since this transition will affect circular economy or the exports of these materials, both in primary and secondary materials, there'll be maybe two implications. So the first one is that some economies may need to think about diversifying their economies. And the second one is that the circular economy transition needs to be inclusive of thinking about the supply chains as well. So ensuring environmentally sustainable and just transition, especially for the extractive sector, is vital, and this needs to be considered as well. So that's all from my side.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shunta, for summarizing that really well. I mean, it's a crazy amount of data and modeling that's gone into that. Marianne, I think I'd come back to you to pick up on something you said earlier about trade policies and particularly the free trade agreements that the EU has with different trading partners, and how do you want to share maybe a specific case study on how, particularly with some recent developments, I think, on how these FTAs can promote circular economy in the trading partner country?
Tavi, I will. I think you're referring to perhaps, the case of EU and Vietnam, are you? Precisely. So let's try to make this more concrete in terms of, EU trade agreements and what they can do for circularity, sustainable circularity, particularly. So picking up a case of EU and Vietnam. So EU and Vietnam have just relatively recently signed up a bilateral trade treaty. And in that particular trade treaty, there is, as in all EU trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, there is a trade and sustainable development chapter. And that sustainable development chapter's purpose is to ensure that this trade is sustainable. It complies with the national laws and legislative baselines and also international laws. And importantly, it can, if so chosen, also really to be used to try to facilitate and boost sustainable trade in certain sustainable products, like, for example, in circular economy context. A number of EU trade agreements have a reference that trade partners would be cooperating in a context of resource efficiency. That's kind of like the old lingo for circular economy. But the new trade agreements more increasingly actually mention circular economy even specifically, the ones in negotiation. So EU-Vietnam mentions cooperation in terms of resource efficiency, in terms of sustainable consumption and things like that, which can be then used to facilitate also circular trade. This is important for EU-Vietnam context because e-waste particularly is an issue in Vietnam. So e-waste is an issue in Vietnam, and therefore the EU-Vietnam circular economy, so EU-Vietnam trade agreement can be used to support sustainable exports from the EU of e-waste to Vietnam, and EU and Vietnam should certainly also kind of demand that from the EU as well. EU has legislation in place that it should not be exporting e-waste if it's unusable, but there are loopholes here, and illegal waste exports are happening. So now this new trade agreement could be used to really improve this e-waste relationship between EU and Vietnam when happening. And also much more broadly, it can be used as a basis to help Vietnam to support through aid for trade, for example, and development cooperation and trade-related assistance to support its e-waste treatment and to help to make the trade sustainable. E-waste can, in principle, be beneficial for both parties. Traditionally, there's been a lot of issues because e-waste treatment, is environmentally and also socially unsustainable if there aren't facilities in place in the trade partner countries to deal with the waste. So that really needs to be happening. So now this new treaty between EU and Vietnam, even if it doesn't explicitly say, let's work on EU e-waste, it can be used for that if the trade partners come to the table and, also the civil society in both countries gets engaged through the trade agreement and trade relationship as well. So that's the one concrete way through which EU's trade agreement could be used to support sustainable circularity in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Marianne, for sharing that. And I think that also sort of speaks to this element of just transition that Michael brought up earlier and Shunta mentioned as well. So we've talked about the EU and Vietnam, sort of zooming back out to a global level. I'm sure many of you in the room know there's been a recent call by businesses and organizations across the world for a global treaty, for UN treaty on plastic pollution. Kristin, can I have you sort of weigh in on that? Since that call came out, what have you been hearing from the various stakeholders, and how might this entire, treaty potentially pan out?
Yes, it's a really interesting. Sorry, Pavi. Yeah, indeed, it's a really interesting question and a very good point in the conversation for this, because we've had so many other points that we've talked about: standardization, harmonization, transparency, etc. And we, Global Plastic Action Partnership, are a neutral but very inclusive platform, and we really believe in the power of action through dialogue. So we're happy to serve as an avenue to convene global stakeholders to discuss the creation of a potential global treaty. And it's been, it's being championed by a number of our partners, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, WWF, and a handful of other international organizations, but also a lot of different businesses, many of whom sit on our governing council and steering board. You may have also seen, even last week, as recently as maybe Wednesday, under the leadership of Minister Lord Zach Goldsmith, the UK have now also come out strongly in favour of this treaty. So there's definitely a lot of appetite and support amongst the community to really move the needle on this. And essentially, this is meant to be seen as the Paris Agreement for plastics, right? So how did we get everybody to coalesce around one specific climate agreement that we can then start to find our own ways to address it? So we understand that the treaty envisions a world in which plastic action is better coordinated, better realized, better measured. That way governments and businesses can actually sign on to a commitment of all of these actions and policies that would catalyze a much more comprehensive global effort to address this problem at scale. And I believe that, it would then really help to put the world on this path towards a global economy, for global circular economy for plastics. So it establishes an international framework for both governments and companies to more decisively start moving in the right direction. And again, it's my understanding that when we think about this, if you think about it as the Paris Accord for plastics, it allows countries, governments to make a commitment toward that, and then to devise their own path towards implementation. So it's a wonderfully commitment level, but then also we need to start thinking about what kinds of activities and actions will be needed to help those governments and to help those companies and supply chains actually reach those commitments. But it's exciting to see the conversations happening around this that will bring greater transparency and greater harmonization as we all look to unlock the circular economy for plastics.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kristin. I think we'll have to keep our eye on how that's gonna, what movements we're gonna see in that area very soon. And maybe we need to bring this panel together again in a few months. I think, just conscious of time here, we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left. Vincent, I think we lost you for a second, but so glad to see you're back. I think what we'd really like to do in the remaining few minutes is to sort of ask all of our panelists this question of where to from here. Each of you are in very distinct organizations with very distinct roles to play. So we have, I think, an understanding of the challenges, some solution directions that are emerging, but where to from here? And I'm going to actually leave you to volunteer to answer this. Vincent, thank you for coming back.
I don't know, my internet conked off, so sorry. No, I just moving on. So what we've noticed here on the ground is that there is a lot of waste that is created here, generated, which is then transported a couple of 100 kilometers away to get processed. And this is with plastics, but also with glass, rubber, paper. And then often these materials, they come back then into the state. So that is not very circular. So I think there are a lot of opportunities here locally for interesting technologies from Europe, that we could, where we could have cross-border collaborations where they could, collectively produce manufacturing units where the materials can be processed. And then there's also the market opportunities. That the Indian market is, of course, huge, but there are also then, I love what everybody's been saying about the standards that the EU is looking at for types of materials. So if we can look at secondary materials potentially that are manufactured in India, then they can maybe be shipped, across border back to Europe. So that could also be, a market opportunity. So that's just something that I would like to highlight, and something that we're really passionate about looking to and coming up with solutions there.
Right. If this was at the end of the panel, I would have totally called on the rest of the panelists to weigh in all the considerations that need to go into building a model like that. But we'll keep that for another day. Back to that question of where to from here and what role do you play, within your organization, as your organization, the rest of our panelists. Hi, Shunta.
Yes, I'll be very brief, but I think from here, we really understand now that trade does have a role for the circular economy transition. Sometimes policymakers think that this is more of a domestic or national issue, but we really need discussions happening for cross-border collaboration, as Vincent mentioned. This could be on trying to address regulatory barriers, trying to set forth standards, for instance, on secondary raw materials, more on a global scale that's more harmonized, or to increase transparency and traceability. And these discussions, of course, can happen with our organization within the OECD, but also at other multilateral levels, such as the WTO, UN frameworks, and the partnerships, as Kristin mentioned. There can also be regional dialogues, such as Marianne mentioned, on regional trade agreements or aid for trade programs. So a lot of avenues to explore. One thing that I do want to highlight is that it's not only the role of governments to talk to each other, which happens quite frequently. We really need to involve a broader range of stakeholders, such as the civil society, academia, experts, IGOs, and especially the private sector, because the private sector really has an interest to undertake circular economy business models that can easily stem across borders, and they need to be part of the discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Shunta. Marianne, Enrique, Kristin, inviting you to weigh in. Enrique?
Say something. Yeah, no, I mean, the way forward, I think now is everybody's working on similar but different areas. I think it's important that we continue linking up on our, speaking as UN here, on our assistance to governments, especially developing country governments in our case. Many governments are willing to regulate, to understand the problem, and to participate in global fora, but they often need help. Connection with plastics alliances, like Kristin mentioned, and also the WBCSD is working on this in Geneva. development aid partners, the UNDP, FAO. There are many organizations you need working on different dimensions, for example, of the plastics problem. As part of UNCTAD, we have a program called SMEP, which I put a link in the chat box. We are doing now a study on plastic substitutes for South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. So we try to give a long life to this study and use this study looking at intergovernmental processes that can profit from it, and hopefully gauge more political and action towards the team. So we are all part of a small force trying to move the solid to a certain direction, and it's important that we link up so that our collective direction is more or less synchronized.
Thank you, Enrique. Wonderful. Kristin and Marianne.
Shall I go in first? Is it okay, Kristin? I'll just do very briefly something that, so way forward in the EU. I think way forward in the EU, that which we at IEP will be also very much supporting, is going to be the way of policy coherence. So I think that's also what we've been talking about in different ways during this panel here, that, the circular economy policies need to be talking with trade policies, that need to be talking with also development cooperation policies. And that's really important in the EU context, to make sure that these silos don't exist, but, they actually are talking to one another, and these policy areas are taken forward in a coherent manner. So we will have a sustainable circular economy in the EU and also globally in the future as well. And one key thing to look at in this context, going back to Enrique's brilliant data figures, I think, is to look at different sectors that EU will be now focusing on in the circular economy action plan. So what happens with textiles? What happens with vehicles? So beyond plastics, the other circular economy streams, and tease those out and provide information in that space to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the plastics the way we did it first and then have to go back on it, but actually make it better in the first go. So those are our thoughts and what we will be working on in the future with partners, most of whom in this call as well, and hopefully actually everybody else as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marianne.
Right. Pavi, just being very, very quick, because I know we're a minute over, I would say what all the other panelists have just said at the very end, which is we need partners, as Marianne said. And as Shubta described, is also throughout the entire value chain, all the private sector players have a role. But one of the most important parts of the value chain that we almost always overlook is the informal sector. And in order for us really to promote the circular economy for plastics, we must address the informal sector and appreciate and support waste pickers. So, if we look at this broader picture, there's also a clear need for us to support them and engage them in these conversations and dialogues as we look to transition ourselves to a circular economy for plastics.
Excellent. Thank you for bringing up the informal sector. Where I am in India, a lot of the work is around, do you formalize the informal sector? Do you build models around that informality? What exactly do you do? And we're actually seeing the emergence of some very, very interesting models, some wonderful social enterprises that are picking up on that and building on it. So thank you so much to the panelists for, doing that quick wrap up, which, means that I don't have to do much of a wrap up. Just a couple of quick deviations. There's a link to a feedback form in the chat box. It will be wonderful if you can fill that out for us, tell us what we're doing right, not so right, what we can do better. We'd love to hear from you. That helps us for the remaining part of the series, as well as anything else we put up later on, and maybe not in an online format anymore, right? While you guys fill that out, I'm gonna try and sort of do my own 1 minute. I think we've had, we started sort of hearing where these intersections are between domestic circular economy policies and and trade policy, and some of the tensions and some of the things that we have to look out for. Then we went, into the data, some wonderful analysis on how the network analysis and what that implies in terms of who is at the table talking about the trade policy. And some wonderful insights on the volumes, the value, and the impact of the scrap trade that's going on globally. And also speaking to some of the requirements for data and transparency, which was highlighted further by what Enrique was saying about, we don't quite understand why this is shaping up like this. We expected something different. So what's really going on there? How do we dig into that? Then we heard from Marianne on, very specifically what the EU Circular Economy Action Plan means for global trade, and then how trade policy in the EU can sort of help to build circular economy in different regions with different trade partners. And then Vincent, wonderful insights from on the ground in Goa. And we'll look to see what that model turns out to be, this cross-collaborative model that you're building. And Kristin, I think that work is so great in setting the course forward for plastics on, how do you bring trade, circular economy and plastics together. And wonderful to hear about all of your roles, the intersectionality of those roles. And thank you particularly for bringing out the point about stakeholders having to come together. That's been sort of some of my key takeaways, and I particularly loved hearing about the just transition, and it's great to see that that's pretty much on everyone's mind, and we're not talking about policies that are likely to favor one region over other, and all this immense amount of thought that's going into how do we make this work for everyone. That's been really great. So thank you so much to our panelists for, bringing out all of these insights in what has been just, I think, over an hour and 10 minutes. Thank you to the audience for some of your questions. I think those were answered in the chat box, so we're not quite picking them up here. So thank you everyone so much for being here and the wonderful insights. And I hope we could do this again as this momentum around trade and circular economy picks up.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Well done.
Bye.
Bye-bye.